Welcome to Truth Behind History. Today we are diving into how crisis transforms power, not just in the moment, but for generations after. Let me ask you something. What happens when the exception becomes the rule? When temporary emergency measures stop being temporary? That's the heart of today's exploration, because throughout history, moments of crisis have served not just as turning points, but as doorways through which governments pass and rarely return. You've probably heard the phrase, "Never let a good crisis go to waste." It's been attributed to politicians across the spectrum, from Churchill to Rahm Emanuel. But it isn't just a catchy soundbite. It's a blueprint, a strategic understanding that panic, fear, and uncertainty open space for action that would never be accepted under normal conditions. In political theory, we call this the state of exception. That's when governments temporarily suspend ordinary laws, often with the justification of protecting the public. In a state of exception, the rules get bent or broken because the stakes are supposedly too high to play fair. But here's the problem. That exception? It tends to stick around. We see this again and again. In ancient Rome, dictators were granted temporary powers in times of emergency. The idea was simple: concentrated authority would make swift, decisive action possible. But over time, those temporary dictatorships laid the groundwork for authoritarian control and the eventual rise of emperors. Fast forward to the American Civil War. President Lincoln invoked sweeping wartime powers, including the suspension of habeas corpus. Those were extraordinary times, and many argue those measures were necessary. But even then, critics warned, powers granted in war rarely disappear in peace. This pattern repeats like a historical echo. Emergencies justify extraordinary measures, but history shows those measures rarely expire on schedule. So today, we're peeling back the layers of this historical truth. We'll look at real moments, real policies, where governments expanded power under the guise of safety, and ask, what happens when the temporary becomes permanent? Because understanding this pattern, that's how we stop it from repeating. Now let's travel back to one of the deadliest pandemics in modern history, the Spanish flu of 1918 to 1920. At first glance, it might seem like just another tragic chapter in the history of disease. But when you look closer, it wasn't just about public health. It was about control, and it set precedents that echo through every health crisis since. So let's break it down. When the Spanish flu struck, the world was already deep in the chaos of World War I. Governments were desperate to maintain morale. Enter the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, laws that weren't originally designed for pandemics, but were quickly used to censor information about the flu. Newspapers were silenced. Doctors were pressured. Any reporting that could undermine the war effort was suppressed. Think about that for a moment. People were dying in the streets, but the press couldn't freely report on it, not because of uncertainty, but because the government decided the truth was too dangerous. In effect, public perception was managed, not informed. Now add in mass obedience campaigns. Public health officials launched aggressive initiatives to control the population. Schools closed, businesses shuttered, mask mandates spread across cities. Slogans like "Obey the laws" and "Wear the gauze" plastered walls and newspapers. Sound familiar? But here's the deeper layer. This wasn't just about compliance for safety. It was compliance through narrative control. The government framed obedience as patriotic. If you didn't follow the rules, you weren't just careless, you were un-American. And beneath it all, a new kind of precedent was being set, what we now call biopolitical governance. That means the state began asserting authority not just over behavior, but over biology, over bodies, health decisions, mobility, even what you could say publicly. All of it suddenly fell under government jurisdiction. This wasn't just an emergency response. It was the beginning of a model, where crises gave governments the excuse to define what counts as truth, what counts as safety, and who gets to decide. So the Spanish flu wasn't just a health disaster. It was a rehearsal for what it looks like when governments seize the narrative, frame obedience as virtue, and rewrite the rules of bodily autonomy. And as we'll see, this playbook gets reused again and again. After the towers fell on September 11, 2001, everything changed. And I don't just mean airport security or foreign policy, I mean the boundaries of what governments could do, legally, permanently, and often invisibly. In the weeks after the 9th of November, Americans were grieving, terrified, and looking for answers. And just 45 days later, while that fear still hung heavy in the air, Congress passed the USA Patriot Act. Hundreds of pages, rushed through with minimal debate. What did it do? It opened the floodgates for unprecedented surveillance and law enforcement powers. It allowed the government to monitor phone calls, financial records, emails, and even library checkouts, all under the banner of national security. This was the modern version of the state of exception. In the name of safety, the rules changed overnight. But it didn't stop there. The Department of Homeland Security was born. A massive new agency, cobbled together from existing parts, now armed with expanded intelligence authority and enormous resources. Domestic surveillance became institutionalized, not a one-time effort, but a permanent architecture. And globally, the reach was even further. We later learned, thanks to whistleblowers like Edward Snowden, just how far that surveillance spread. Entire nations were monitored. Leaders of allied countries were tracked. Entire populations had their metadata scooped up and stored, not because they were suspects, but just in case they ever became one. This is the legacy of 9/11, a surveillance state that normalized mass data collection as routine, not extraordinary. And perhaps most chilling of all, the cultural shift. People accepted it. They traded privacy for a sense of safety. And once that line was crossed, it became nearly impossible to draw it again. Ask yourself, how many laws passed during wartime or in moments of national panic ever get repealed? How many times has surveillance power been rolled back, not expanded? The Patriot Act wasn't just a law, it was a turning point. It revealed how fear, when weaponized, can rewrite the rules of freedom. And in doing so, it permanently altered the relationship between citizen and state. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit in 2020, governments around the world sprang into action, and for many people, that action felt necessary. After all, we were facing an unknown virus, limited data, and a rising death toll. But what began as temporary didn't stay that way. Let's start with emergency powers. The idea was simple: flatten the curve, pause the system, and protect healthcare infrastructure. But those lockdowns? They didn't last for weeks. They lasted for months, and then years. They expanded beyond hospitals and masks to touch nearly every aspect of life: school closures, travel bans, curfews, shuttered businesses, even restrictions on private gatherings. At first, it was framed as a short-term sacrifice. But slowly, those emergency powers hardened into something more enduring. Now, enter the biopolitical tools. Governments and health agencies implemented vaccine mandates, contact tracing programs, and digital health passports. These systems didn't just encourage public health, they redefined what freedom of movement and bodily autonomy looked like. Want to travel? Show your status. Want to keep your job? Disclose your medical information. Want to enter a public space? Scan your code. The body itself became a passport, or a barrier. These tools weren't just responses to the pandemic. They were experiments in governance, where identity, biology, and digital infrastructure merged under centralized control. And once these systems were built, they didn't just vanish. Health passports became part of long-term planning discussions. Central banks explored digital currencies with built-in monitoring. Workplaces integrated compliance tracking. Education, commerce, transportation, all began to reflect this new logic, that access to life could be conditional, and those conditions could change at any moment. This is what we mean by the normalization of controls. It's not that the virus caused this shift, it's that the crisis gave permission. It changed the public's tolerance for surveillance, regulation, and coercion. And once that threshold was crossed, going back became nearly impossible. So ask yourself, how many tools rolled out just for the pandemic are still being used today? How many institutions gave up their emergency authority? COVID-19 didn't just reshape public health, it reshaped governance itself. And the effects are still unfolding. Crisis always comes with a price tag, but not just in human lives or disrupted routines. There's also a financial footprint, a big one. Every time governments centralize control in response to a crisis, they spend. And that spending, more often than not, doesn't come from a savings account. It comes from borrowing, from printing, from kicking the can further down the road. Let's start in 1918, right after World War I. And during the Spanish flu, governments had already borrowed massively to fund the war effort. But when the pandemic struck, that borrowing didn't slow down. It accelerated. And here's the key: those decisions locked nations into dependence on central banking. Instead of small, localized solutions, massive state debts were financed through the printing press, or its modern equivalent. This created inflationary pressure and sowed the seeds of future instability. Fast forward to the early 2000s. After the 9th of November, the United States entered what you could call the security state era. We didn't just expand surveillance, we expanded spending. Defense budgets ballooned. Domestic surveillance infrastructure grew. And all of this required money. So what happened? Deficits soared. Structural debt deepened. The fiscal balance that once restrained government ambitions became irrelevant. And then came 2020. During the COVID pandemic, the floodgates truly opened. Trillions, yes, trillions, with a T, were injected into the economy. Stimulus checks, bailouts, business relief programs, and large-scale asset purchases by central banks. This wasn't just money being moved around. This was money being created. And when you create that much new money, what do you get? Inflation. And not just in one country. The entire global economy felt the ripple effects: food prices, housing, energy, currency devaluation. For many, wages didn't keep up. Savings lost value. And once again, the long-term costs of centralized crisis management came due. But perhaps the most subtle danger of all is moral hazard. When institutions believe they'll be bailed out in every crisis, what incentive do they have to plan carefully, to take responsibility, to limit risk? The pattern is clear. In each crisis, government expands, central banks print, and debt explodes. The bills don't disappear, they just get passed on to future generations, to inflation-strapped households, to nations now trapped in fiscal dependence. So next time you hear the words emergency funding, ask, at what cost? By now, a pattern should be starting to emerge. We call it the crisis playbook, and it's not just a figure of speech. It's a real, repeatable formula that governments and institutions follow when the world seems to fall apart. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. It starts with a shock, a war, a pandemic, a terror attack, something big enough to rattle public confidence. In that moment of confusion, fear sets in, and fear is the perfect breeding ground for centralized power. Suddenly, the rules change. Laws are rushed through. Agencies gain new authority. Temporary measures are rolled out, always with the same promise: this is just for now. But let's be honest, now has a funny way of becoming a forever. What happens next is incentive distortion. See, when institutions are rewarded for their crisis response, more funding, more jurisdiction, more political capital, they begin to prefer crisis conditions. Not consciously, maybe, but structurally. A health agency that gained power during a pandemic will be more likely to amplify future health risks. A defense department that expanded after a terrorist attack will frame more situations as security threats. A central bank that printed money during a downturn will be slower to stop printing, even when inflation starts to rise. It's not that these institutions are evil, it's that the incentives are broken. When you reward fear management instead of risk management, you create a system that thrives on instability. And over time, the public adapts too. We get conditioned, trained, first to comply, then to expect the government to solve every new problem. Personal responsibility fades. Community-level problem-solving fades. All while trust in centralized power grows, right up until it doesn't. But by then, the damage is done. Because the crisis playbook isn't just about emergency powers. It's about what happens after. When those powers don't go away. When bureaucracies swell. When people begin to associate obedience with virtue and question anyone who pushes back. This is how a one-time exception becomes a long-term operating system. So ask yourself, if crises lead to more power, and power creates incentives to exaggerate crisis, what kind of future does that build? Let's take a breath and shift our focus, because not every response to crisis has followed the same centralized path. There are other stories. Stories of resilience, of innovation, of people and communities solving problems without waiting for permission from above. Let's start local. During the 1918 Spanish flu, some cities responded faster and more effectively than others, not because of federal orders, but because local leaders took initiative. St. Louis, for example, imposed social distancing measures weeks before Philadelphia did. The result? Far fewer deaths. The difference wasn't funding. It wasn't national planning. It was timing and local action. During natural disasters like Hurricane Katrina, many of the most effective rescue operations came not from FEMA, but from neighbors, volunteers in boats. Churches turned into shelters, small businesses handing out supplies. While the federal response floundered in bureaucracy, ordinary people stepped up. Even during the COVID pandemic, we saw this again. Local farmers partnered directly with buyers when supply chains failed. Homeschooling networks exploded in size when public education systems shut down. Small, decentralized tech platforms began helping people connect, trade, and share resources without waiting for government approval. What do all these stories have in common? They remind us of something easy to forget during a crisis: we have agency. We are not helpless. We don't always need top-down intervention to survive, adapt, or rebuild. In fact, centralized responses often crowd out these grassroots efforts. When government becomes the sole provider, people lose the muscle memory of self-reliance. And that's dangerous, because the more we outsource problem-solving, the more dependent we become, and the more fragile our systems grow. History gives us examples of the opposite. Voluntary associations, mutual aid societies, cooperative banking in the 1800s, religious institutions that fed the hungry during economic downturns. These weren't perfect systems, but they were decentralized, responsive, and rooted in community trust. Decentralization doesn't mean chaos. It means distributed responsibility. It means multiple layers of response. It means freedom paired with accountability. So the next time we face a crisis, and there will be a next time, maybe the most radical act isn't demanding more from the top, but remembering what we're capable of from the bottom up. Let's take a step back, because by now, the pattern is clear, but the implications run deeper than just surveillance, spending, or temporary laws. The real cost of crisis-driven governance is philosophical. It's moral. It's about what kind of people we become when we surrender too much, too quickly, in the name of safety. Now don't get me wrong, safety matters. Of course it does. But what happens when the pursuit of safety overrides everything else? When the risk of harm is treated as a justification to preempt freedom? This is the danger. When security becomes sacred, liberty becomes negotiable. And once that mindset sets in, it doesn't go away quietly. It becomes cultural, generational. We start to frame independence as reckless, dissent as dangerous, and nonconformity as a threat. Let's call it what it is: soft coercion. Not always through brute force, but through social pressure, bureaucratic hurdles, and digital gates. Do this to keep your job. Say that to stay online. Obey here to unlock access there. Bit by bit, the walls close in. And the irony? The more we're promised safety, the more anxious we become. Because when every action is regulated, and every risk is managed from above, we lose the thing that actually makes societies resilient: the ability to think, act, and adapt freely. History shows us what happens when safety is used as a shield for power. The ancient Romans gave up their republic for the promise of order. 20th century regimes rose by convincing the public they were the only thing standing between them and chaos. And even in democratic nations, we've watched as one crisis after another justified the erosion of checks, balances, and civil liberties. So here's the question: what are we trading? And are we getting a good deal? Because safety is never free. It always comes with a cost. And sometimes, the price is paid not in dollars, but in dignity, in freedom, in the slow, quiet loss of the ability to live life on our own terms. That's the hidden cost. And it's one history warns us about again and again. So, where does that leave us? We've traveled from ancient Rome to the Spanish flu, from 9/11 to COVID-19, and through each stop, the same thread keeps reappearing. Crisis, real or manufactured, acts as an accelerant. It burns through normal procedures. It softens resistance. It opens the door to powers that would have seemed unthinkable just months earlier. And once the fire's out, the structure of power has already changed. We're left with institutions that are bigger, rules that are hard to question, and a culture more willing to comply. But this isn't just a history lesson. It's a challenge, because at every step, history has also shown us another path, a quieter one where local solutions, voluntary cooperation, and individual agency push back against the tide of centralized control, where people choose not to live in fear, and instead reclaim responsibility for their own lives and communities. So here's what I'll leave you with. What kind of crisis response do we want to normalize? Do we want a future where each new emergency triggers sweeping mandates from the top down, or one where resilience starts from the bottom up? And maybe more importantly, are we asking the right questions in the first place? Like, who benefits from prolonged emergency powers? Why do temporary measures so rarely expire? What mechanisms can stop this cycle before it repeats? These aren't easy questions, but they're necessary, because if we don't wrestle with them now, when the crisis is calm, we'll be forced to answer them later, when it's not. Thanks for watching Truth Behind History. If you found this thought-provoking, make sure to like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more deep dives into the stories most people overlook or were never told to begin with. And if you want to dig even deeper, check out my book History They Tried to Erase. The link is in the description. I post new content every day, unpacking the patterns behind the power. So if you're someone who values truth, context, and curiosity, you're in the right place. Until next time, question the narrative and keep exploring.